on more Japanese models. Italy might have more three-wheel cars now. France, its own, more Peugeots. So what we did is the art director, we created these kind of color palettes and little 2D cutouts to show sort of what the crowd should look like at a very very broad level for each location to film. Interestingly enough, we had to get legal clearance to use some of these cars, but this was overall what we wanted them to look like. Now, for the technical needs, it was actually mostly racetracks where we had to populate small groups of characters, about 50 to 100, and various stands along the way. Now, because they were a little closer, we actually needed higher quality than we had originally in the first cars because those stadiums weren't quite as wide. So that's one of the odd things about crowds. Sometimes fewer characters is harder to do than more characters, because when you have a lot of characters, you don't need as much detail. So this is a mistake producers make. They think by cutting the number of characters in a shot, they're saving money. Sometimes you're not. So it's always good to keep in mind that sometimes you can actually hide the details by having more of them. So again, for technical needs, we had to get a little more detailed shading because we had closer crowds in this film, and we wanted them to look very location specific. We wanted to basically, rather than have a simplified shader like we had earlier that was just sort of plastic and a color for the crowds, we tried having texture maps derived from the original shaders that had things like specular color, reflection color, every component of the shading into its own set of texture maps. And breaking that down a little, one material might have this number of layers: dust, grease, clear coat, car paint, rust, metal. And each of those might have a lot of parameters we want to vary. KD would be diffuse color, KS, specular, Kara, reflection, etc. And then we'd have a bunch of these layers. However, that would be too many textures. So what we did is actually average them across all of the layers into just one set of texture files. Now this is an approximation, but good enough for crowds. And that's kind of the number of textures we get in the end. Similar to what's done in games. In games, you typically can't afford multiple layers of materials. You average the parameters together. And in the end, this is what we used in this example, where we can get that car on the right looking so close to the car on the left, because we kept track of all those different material parameters. Now for the animation, we worked pretty hard on this movie to actually get shaders that would animate the mouths and eyes. So we just had a single set of texture. The shader would do the eye animation, as well as different masks for where the headlights were and so on. So here's an example, I think I showed this earlier, of the shader actually animating the face. This is really fancy, but this is one way with cars to actually avoid having a set of textures per frame to get the work done. And in the end, we were able to use this fairly successfully on quite a number of cars. So here's all the different sort of background cars we have. I forget how many we had in the film, but certainly over 100. And you can see we have different styles of cars, that were very locations. Like I think, Mini Cooper meant more likely to be in England and so on. Now, because we had so many textures, we had ways to optimize that process. I'm going to skip over that a little. All right, and again, for unique car shapes, we did have stretching for any concavities in the shrink wrapping process. So like I said earlier, we got rid of anything that had a concavity in it, which was usually just the rear side mirrors, which people probably didn't notice. Same thing with these weird pit crew cars. There was stretching, and that was okay. The render times speak for itself. Again, sorry, we went over this earlier in the render optimization portion, but we went from 120 minutes going down to 90 minutes far away to way lower, just over 30, to almost nothing far away when we did the shrink wrapping. Same thing with memory. Memory actually went up far away with the real cars, but with shrink wrapping, it went down. And here's an example of a breakdown shot. So there's this crowds. We did have flags and props, which was his own set of challenges. There's all the different crowd elements, and finally, what those sort of, again, 50 to 100 stand sections would look like on a crowd shot on cars. And again, those are all little displaced rectangles. Get that out. Now, one thing we also did was worked a bit on how to lay out crowds. We actually ended up using Houdini as a tool to lay out the crowds, even though we used massive simulator. And we did that because Houdini had very fast preview mechanisms where you can really reduce the poly count of the characters, and very cool tools to spread them out over a shot. So I'm hoping we have some examples here. Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't show that again. So you can tell this is not my presentation, this one. This is someone else's that I'm borrowing. All right, so we started with, again, simplified mesh. To show you how it scales, Houdini is very, very good at drawing lots of things in its viewport with instancing. So this will show you a little bit about how much they can scale. So here's the custom guide. And I think we start with just a couple. I'm going to ramp the number up. It's a ridiculous number of cars Houdini can draw, because it's doing actually instancing on the graphics card. So we actually found it a great tool for laying these out. Similarly, in a real shot, we can kind of bring in the terrain and use Houdini's little toolkit for moving these guys around. Because Houdini has lots of things like ways of snapping characters to the ground, as well as making higher level controls to sort of lay out whole bunches of them. So here's another scene where we're using Houdini to do procedural layout. And for those who don't know, Houdini is typically used for special effects, like explosions and rivers and things, but we find it's actually very good for set dressing and modeling as well. And here we're showing how we're doing procedural layout as well as look-ats. We're clicking around, getting characters to look at one location versus another. But this is the look-at example. Well, that's where we're actually painting the distribution of them. Houdini's got great paint tools, so we're using that to for density. Typically, you can take in like an image file as some sort of density map to scatter points, and that's live in Houdini. And here's the look-ats. So by look-ats, I mean it's a certain point where you want all the crowds to look. And we actually had very good luck setting initial look-ats or even animating them over time using Houdini. And I think in some special case scenes, we were doing animated look-ats. All right, now for animation, we also used curve following, which is actually a very simple way of creating curves and animating along them. That turns out to be a very good way to animate cars. And we are able to do this in Houdini actually for fairly large crowds, and then time the characters along the curves so they're not intersecting each other. So this is the first show we used Houdini for crowds. This is actually one of the main tools we're using right now, and we had a lot of good luck with that. I think this is some more examples of using curves, where we have a very packed layout of cars, and we have these curves that go between these crowds. This is actually a scene where you have cars serving drinks to other cars at a party, and the ones that are serving drinks are sort of animated along the paths. All right, so, and traffic as well. Like this. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we animated the cars in Massive. Ultimately, we mostly use Houdini for layout, as well as look-ats and some of those simple setups. For traffic simulation, we use Massive. We sort of used lessons from robotics to get this done. This is a slide on subsumption architecture. I'm not going to go into that too much. The main idea is one behavior subsumes another. So we sort of have this list of modules in our robots, where each behavior can subsume the other at a different intensity. So the decision model we used was based on time till impact, and it sort of looks like this. We created a driving system. They're all going along their lanes. They have a system for changing lanes, or if there's an opening, they can go from one to another. Yeah, here's the collision detection. We detect time till impact and then slow down accordingly. We also have preferences for some directions versus others. Some people more like to go left, some more like to go right. Yielding, good for intersections. And for traffic, we did actually create a traffic light system for orderly flow of traffic. And actually it was really interesting. We looked at lots of reference for real traffic to look at this. And roundabout, England has lots of these things. So we worked a bit to make sure that those were going. And finally, those brain springs we used on Wally to get springy motion. We use that for the suspension of the cars as well. That's an example of reused techniques. And then finally, we had more milling crowds as well. So in the end, we did look at some research to figure out how to calculate this time to impact. I'm not going to go over that in too detail, but in general, we found that was the best way to figure out to make them slow down accordingly. I'm going to skip over a couple of these. Oh, and one thing for animation plusing. Sorry, so many slides here. We often found it necessary to fix up animation after simulation. And this is true on Wall-E and many other films. But one of the challenges for cars is, what we got out of Massive was a keyframe per frame on TX, TY, TZ, RX, RYRC. That's a lot of animation to work with. Rather, what we did is, so we had a system for stationary crowds. It was fine to have that kind of animation, but for moving crowds, what we wanted out the other end was actually a curve that showed the trajectory of the car, and then one animated parameter that tells you how far along the curve you are. And we found animators much prefer to work with curve animation as opposed to having keyframes on every frame for every degree of freedom. So that was a system we had to create to fit curve animation to the output of Massive. So here's an example of, believe it or not, a shot where we did a lot of animation plusing. We did the original animation in Massive, promoted them to real characters, and once they're on the curve, the animators could do their proper job. So that was Cars 2. Sorry I had that broken out into an extra different presentation. The reason I did that was because so it was actually a friend's presentation, and it was at a different aspect ratio than the original. Moving beyond it, here's Brave. So how many people saw Brave, out of curiosity? All right, a lot of people. I'm glad to hear, because I spent 2.5 years of my life working with that film. So it's good to know that people have watched the movie. So I was the crowd lead on this film, which is why I worked on it for so long. And I'll go over, this is actually a really quick presentation, how we did the effect. So first I'll talk about sort of what the challenges were, what the art direction was, then a little bit about the technology we used for the crowds in the film. So it's actually the largest human crowds we had since Wall-E. We actually don't work with humans that often. And we find it's actually, you can get away a lot more with rats and dogs, robots, non-human characters than we deal with humans. Humans always provide the biggest animation challenge. So if anyone of you are thinking about saving time in terms of what kind of character you want to animate, watch out for humans. There's a lot that needs to go into that. So that made the fidelity requirements very high. They're also quite complicated because they're wearing clothing and they had hair. So whereas in Wall-E they were wearing spandex on floating chairs. So it's far more complicated characters. Also, one of the things that really changed is we use our own animation software at Pixar, and we had a very big overhaul where we went from something we used to call Marionette or Mendy to a system called Presto. This is our current system. And once we went to that, it actually, like most new technology, it's always slower to begin with. So even if you spend 5 years creating a new tool, it's always worse the first year you're using it until eventually it gets better. So we had lots of speed challenges to deal with this film. Now, in the past, as I said, we did finite state machines for crowds like on Bugs Life. We had some sort of procedural motion model like on Nemo. we call that Pisces. And again, we had finite state machines for stuff on cars. Those are sort of the classic approaches, often done in games. The more modern crowd approaches we did, like on Ratatouille, Wall-E, and Cars 2, we used agent-based simulation, like done in Masters, where you're doing more like robotics to get the job done. Now, while the modern approaches can allow some of the most flexibility and power in what we can do, the big catch is what comes out the other end for animators. This is what all of the animation splines look like. So, like in Blender or Maya, if you look at your graph editor, picture having to animate with this. All those knots that per frame, wildly different values. Animators hate this. No one animates this way. If you have to do a fix on a character, and the animation comes out like this, they're going to hate it. So this was always a problem with those more modern approaches. Now there has been some research to address this with facial animation, but in general this is an unsolved problem. So we actually ended up going back to more classical approaches on Brave because we found it not worth the extra pain of this sort of animation data to use the more modern approaches. Part of that had to do with the crowd's direction. We were inspired by a comic called Gru, which was very detailed. We had all these characters sort of interact with each other very uniquely. Quite a lot of detail and direction in the crowds. So a lot of animation fix-up was necessary. And we had a director, Mark Andrews, that was very much inclined to call out notes on individual characters. Also, when you looked at the type of shots we had in our storyboards, we had many shots of characters, say, at a feast, standing and cheering, reacting, but mostly stationary, with the exception of some marching on the lower right. The vast majority of the crowds were stationary, which also led us to go back to more traditional crowd techniques, like using finite state machines and animation clips. So the motion plan for that film was to, again, start with state machines. We created a new system called Wilma. Note the naming convention. Started with Fred, then went to Barney, now it's Wilma. It's all Flintstones. I'm familiar with Flintstones. Anyway, this system was Wilma. And we wanted to be very aggressive in terms of having good playback. Again, because of the speed hit we took from going to new software. We wanted the crowds to be fast. And we wanted to figure out how to intelligently reuse hair and cloth. So we didn't need to run hair and cloth simulation on each crowd character. And for those very exceptional shots, like the marching at the larger scale, we thought we might use massive again, but in a more lightweight pipeline just for those shots. More like an effects artist version of the shot. So the technology for making things fast is called TIDScene, for time index diction of the scene. And I'll explain a little what it is. It's a file format that just encodes geometry, either at a model level or a shot level. It doesn't have things like the rig in it or shader parameters. It's just the geometry per frame. And it's lightweight and portable, and we've developed it to be usable in all of our software, from our custom software Presto to Maya to RenderNet. And what that means is it doesn't have an execution system. It's just points over time. Has anyone heard of something called Alembic before? All right, that's the equivalent of TIDScene for Maya. And if you want to pass Maya information to other programs, Alembic is kind of a way to do it. We just have our own system called TIDScene that does that. And I'm going to skip over the key features, but suffice to say it's really fast. And it's useful because, again, it's efficient and it's application independent. So this is what our proprietary software Presto looks like. That's a scene in it. That's that same scene in Maya. And that same scene in an independent viewer called TIDScene. So, TIDScene viewer, TDS viewer. So we use that system to draw the crowds really quickly. The catch is you couldn't actually edit it after the fact. In this representation, it's non-editable. It's read only, but it's fast. Here's the performance data. I'll skip that. Now the system we have for sequencing the clips together, we called it Wilma. And what it looks like is this. It's actually that editor embedded on the right hand of our software, and it kind of looks like a spreadsheet. What that's showing is which clip of animation the characters are playing at which frame in time. On the left is that state machine that I showed you guys earlier. And I believe that this one goes from standing around to cheering to crying, something like that. And that's how it's all sequenced together. And at the bottom is actually the view of the characters playing those motions. Here's a slightly more elaborate example. This is a keep alive state machine. On the left is one type of keep alive with two variations. On the right is another type of keep alive, some variations, and then there's transitions between them. Here's what that looks like. Basically, one of them is them kind of gossiping, looking left, and the other one is just raising their hand. And they're just kind of randomly walking over the state machine, and it adds a lot of variation. You might think this looks like a video game. And you're right, this is how animation is done in video games. You typically have short clips of animation that are sequenced together like this, transition. Now, to make it look less robotic, we often need longer cycles for more detailed animation. This is an early test to show that it works. Here's an example on an actual shot, one from a sequence called Back to the Castle. We have all these angry Scottish people yelling at each other. And every character gets animation like this. So this is very important for this shot to use the system so that animators can touch up the results after the fact. Again, because if we did it was massive, there'd be too many, the data would be too complicated to work. But the finite state machines still help. And here's one example how. So we use triggers, just like in cars, where we have this radial field set up, where you can see motion propagate from the inside to the outside as Merida yells shudder. So I'm going to add some volume. That takes animation. Alright, well, one of the slides does, and it will surprise us all. So we have some trigger going there. Here's an example up close. We see that animation kind of propagates from the front to the back. And again, this is just a transition in a state machine going from one clip to another. But we're using the spatial location to say when that trigger happens. And I think here's the actual shot. There we go. And it propagates. Alright, so how did we create those clips for Wilma? From here on, we're not going to talk about clips. I mean, this is what we call them internally. Clips of animation we call ALIBs, or animation libraries. And I'm also going to use the term AVAR occasionally, which stands for an animation variable, or something you can keyframe, like translation or rotation of the arm. And typically what we do is we start with the source, which is a bunch of animation with AVARs. We make a copy for each character. So we'll start with like the most normal character. On Brave, his name is McGregor, Wallace McGregor is the character. And he's the most average. We started by copying over to all the other similar characters. And then we would introduce some variations to get more clip choices. Particularly, we often do a mirroring operation. So here's an example. Here's the initial animation clip. You note he's going out of frame. That's to illustrate sometimes the animation you get has controls animated that we don't want in there, like size and scale. So the first thing we do is we clean it up by getting rid of forbidden keyframes, things like scale. I'm going to skip that slide, but we have a system for not introducing new knots. We'll remove those things. Then we transfer it to several characters. So you see it goes from one in the middle to two on the side. And when we transfer them, though, we have to be careful because sometimes the animation doesn't look good when you transfer. So look on the right, that fat character, that clapping is now going through his body. So you got to be careful when we copy. In fact, what's worse is on the bottom. Look at that little guy going